It begins with a whisper carried by the wind, a sound of hooves slicing through the endless plains of Central Asia. To the farmers and villagers of the early 4th century, that sound was not mere thunder. It was a warning, a herald of something far more terrifying than the storms of heaven. They were coming. The Huns. No one truly knew where they came from. Some said they were forged in the depths of hell itself, born from the cursed steppe winds and the ashes of forgotten empires. Others believed they were descendants of ancient demons, unleashed to punish the arrogance of men. What was certain, however, was their purpose: destruction, plunder, and domination. The Huns were unlike any people the world had ever seen. They rode small, fierce horses that seemed to merge with their riders, man and beast moving as one. Their bows, carved from bone and sinew, could pierce armor at 100 paces. They fought not in formation, but in chaos, a living storm that devoured everything in its path. Villages vanished overnight, fires swallowed homes, and survivors spoke of warriors whose eyes reflected no mercy. Among them rose one figure who would become legend: Attila. Even before his name was feared, his ancestors had already built the foundation of terror across the European steppes. They moved westward, swallowing tribes like a flood. The Alans, the Goths, the Vandals, all fell or fled before them. The Roman borderlands trembled as rumors spread. An unstoppable horde was approaching, driven by hunger and fury. But beyond their brutality, the Huns were a mystery. They spoke an unknown tongue. They worshipped unseen gods. Their tents were decorated with the skulls of enemies, polished like trophies. To them, death was not an end. It was a reminder that power belonged only to the ruthless. And so the question echoes across the centuries: what force could create such people? Were they born of men, or something darker? Perhaps the truth lies buried under the ashes of those first burning villages, where the roar of the past still lingers in the wind. If this tale of ancient terror grips your curiosity, leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe, because what comes next will take you even deeper into the darkness of history. They struck like lightning, silent, sudden, and merciless. To the untrained eyes of European villagers, the Huns were not soldiers but phantoms on horseback. The earth trembled before them, yet by the time their thunder reached your ears, it was already too late. Their power was not in numbers but in movement. No army in the known world could match their speed. They lived in the saddle. They ate, slept, and even negotiated from horseback. Their mounts, bred for endurance and obedience, were the very extension of their will. When the Huns descended on a village, they did not march. They swarmed, surrounding the settlement like a living tide, cutting off every escape. The Romans had walls. The Germans had forests. The Huns had the steppe, and in that vastness they were gods. Their strategy was simple and terrifying: strike before the enemy even realized he was at war. Villages awoke to the sound of burning thatch, to screams piercing the night. There was no time for defense. The spear was their gospel, and through it they preached submission. Each Hun warrior carried a composite bow, curved, deadly, and capable of killing at impossible distances. They would gallop in circles, releasing arrows with eerie precision, breaking enemy lines long before any blade met flesh. When the enemy faltered, the Huns closed in, switching to sabers and lances. They killed swiftly and without hesitation, leaving corpses as warnings for those who dared resist. But the terror did not end with battle. Survivors who fled into the forests often found their villages unrecognizable upon return. The dead left unburied, the livestock butchered, the soil soaked in ash and blood. The Huns made sure their message was clear. Resistance meant extinction. To the Romans, they were barbarians. To those who faced them, they were something worse, a living nightmare made flesh. The fury of horse and spear was not just a tactic, it was a philosophy, a doctrine of fear carved into the land itself. And as their black banners rose against the dawn, The world began to realize this was not conquest. This was annihilation. The Danube, the great river that once marked the boundary of civilization, became a graveyard of nations. For centuries, it had separated the disciplined order of Rome from the chaos of the steppes beyond. But when the Huns arrived, that ancient line of defense dissolved like mist before a storm. The first to fall were the Goths. Their scouts returned with tales of burning villages, of riders who moved faster than the wind, of arrows that struck from nowhere. Entire tribes abandoned their lands, flooding toward the Roman frontier in desperation. The empire, already weakened by civil wars and greed, looked across the river and saw not enemies, but a tide of terror pushing ever closer. The Huns did not simply invade, they consumed. Each conquered tribe was forced into service, feeding the horde with soldiers, slaves, and supplies. The Danube, once a symbol of life, became the artery through which fear itself flowed. Towns along its banks emptied overnight. Even the air seemed to change, heavy with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. When they reached the Roman limes, the frontier, fortresses that had stood for centuries fell with shocking ease. The defenders were paralyzed, not by numbers, but by the whispers that preceded the Huns' arrival. Stories of skinning captives alive, of children impaled to terrify survivors, spread faster than the horsemen themselves. Terror was their most effective weapon. Invisible, unstoppable, contagious. As the river crossings burned, a strange silence settled over the lands beyond. The world that had once been Rome's northern shield was gone, replaced by endless blackened ruins. Refugees flooded southward, bringing not hope, but panic. They spoke of leaders who made pacts with the Huns only to vanish days later, of entire tribes that ceased to exist. And behind it all, like a shadow stretching across Europe, came the whispers of a new leader, a warlord whose ambition dwarfed all others. His name, still spoken in hushed tones, would soon be known everywhere. Attila. The Danube had been crossed, the flood had begun, and Europe would never again know peace. At dawn, the mist clung to the fields like a shroud. The villagers of the Rhineland rose to another day of dread, a silence too complete, a sky too still. Then came the distant thunder of hooves. It was not a storm. It was the Huns. They came with the rising sun, black silhouettes on the horizon, their lances catching the light like flashes of fire. The first arrows fell before anyone could scream. Children ran. Dogs barked, and then went quiet. The Huns swept in, cutting through fences, torching roofs, and leaving no escape. Their advance was not chaotic. It was precise, disciplined in its brutality. They did not fight men. They erased them. For the Germanic tribes, resistance was suicide. Warriors who dared to stand were skewered, their skulls later displayed as warnings on the ashes of their own homes. The Huns enslaved the survivors, mostly women and children, dragging them eastward to feed the growing shadow of their empire. The rest were left for the crows. Yet the worst wound was not physical but spiritual. The Germans, who had once believed in gods of thunder and war, now questioned whether their deities had abandoned them. Entire cultures vanished in the wake of the Hun advance, their sacred sites desecrated, their songs silenced. The forested lands that had echoed with laughter and ritual became graveyards. Roman chroniclers would later write of the horror with trembling hands. Villages turned to ash, rivers filled with the dead, and the whisper of a single name carried through the smoke. Attila. To those who survived, he was not a man, but a punishment sent by the heavens. And yet, this was only the beginning. The sword of the Huns had not yet reached its full thirst. The empire of terror was still growing, and with every conquest the legend of Attila darkened. Now, I'll turn to you. What do you think it felt like to face an enemy like that? One that seemed unstoppable, almost supernatural? Share your thoughts below, in the comments. Your perspective might just shape the next journey into this age of fear. Nightfall was not a comfort in Hun-conquered lands. It was a sentence. Smoke rose where villages once stood, carrying with it the scent of burning grain, flesh, and despair. The stars above seemed dimmer, veiled by the ashes of what had been life. In the path of the Huns, there was no music, no prayer, no sound, only silence, thick with death. They burned everything. It was not enough to defeat an enemy. They sought to erase him. Fire was their language, a declaration of dominance that spoke louder than words. When the Huns left a village, there was nothing left to reclaim, not even the soil. The heat of their vengeance turned the earth itself into charred dust. Survivors described the aftermath as a landscape of ghosts. Charred beams pointed to the sky like skeletal fingers. The wind carried the cries of the dying until even those faded into the night, and among the ruins, the crows gathered, dark heralds feeding on what little remained of humanity. Yet there was a cruel order in this destruction. Attila's commanders spared no resource that could serve their war machine. Prisoners who surrendered were bound into servitude. Blacksmiths were forced to forge new weapons, farmers to raise horses for the horde. Those who resisted were left impaled along the roads, a forest of bodies marking Hun dominion. And so fire became both a weapon and a message. Each blaze along the Danube and Rhine whispered the same truth. There is no refuge. There is no peace. In the silence that followed, Europe seemed to hold its breath. The old gods were dying, the empires trembling, and across the scorched plains, a new power was rising, one that spoke through terror and ruled through fear. The fire burned not only the land, but the soul of a continent. Rome, once the eternal empire, the unshakable pillar of civilization, began to tremble. Word of the Huns' advance crossed the frontiers, faster than the legions could march. From the Danube to the Italian plains, the whispers grew into cries. Attila is coming. In the marble halls of the imperial courts, fear disguised itself as diplomacy. Generals spoke of strategies, of alliances, but their eyes betrayed the truth. No one knew how to stop what was coming. The empire's frontiers had collapsed, its provinces fractured by greed and civil war. Gold bought peace for a season, but even Rome's treasures could not quench the hunger of the steppe. Ambassadors sent to the Huns returned pale and broken, describing a court where power was measured in blood. Attila, they said, sat upon a wooden throne surrounded by skulls of fallen kings, a barbarian emperor ruling with divine fury. His words were few, his demands simple: tribute or annihilation. As the Huns pushed deeper into the Roman world, the streets of cities once filled with laughter turned to chaos. Refugees flooded southward, women clutching children, priests carrying relics, soldiers abandoning posts. The empire's borders became graveyards, and its people began to whisper of prophecy that Rome, punished for its sins, was now facing God's retribution through the scourge of the earth. In Constantinople, the Great Wall still stood, glimmering in the sunlight, but even they could not silence the terror in the hearts of men. The emperor sent gold, slaves, and promises across the river to buy time, yet everyone knew that time itself was dying. For centuries, Rome had believed the world revolved around its power. Now for the first time it looked outward and saw something it could not understand, something ancient, something inevitable. And as the fires burned across Pannonia and Moesia, the empire that once feared no one began to fear everything, especially the sound of distant hooves echoing in the night. When night fell upon the Hunnic camps, the fires that burned were not for warmth, they were for worship. Amid the smoke and flickering light, the warriors gathered, their faces painted in ash, their armor still wet with blood. It was then that the true face of the Huns revealed itself, not merely conquerors, but priests of death. The steppe was their temple, and war their sacred ceremony. Every victory demanded an offering, and the offerings were human. Captives were bound to stakes, surrounded by the chanting of the Hun warriors. The sound was not music, but invocation, a low, rhythmic growl that seemed to call something unseen. Some accounts speak of sacrifices burned alive, others of victims flayed and their skulls kept as trophies to honor the spirits of war. The skulls were polished, lined with gold, and turned into drinking cups. To drink from the head of an enemy was to absorb his courage, a grotesque communion between killer and slain. These rituals were not acts of madness. They were acts of belief. The Huns saw life and death as a cycle of dominance. To conquer was to please the gods. To die in battle was to feast with them. When Attila rose to lead them, these rites grew even darker. His generals were required to partake in what the Romans would later call the banquet of death, a ritual meal where warriors drank the blood of enemies as a sign of loyalty. Around the fire, chants echoed into the night, merging with the wind across the plains. To outsiders, it was horror. To the Huns, it was harmony. Such scenes terrified the civilized world. Roman chroniclers refused to describe them in full, fearing the very words might summon what they depicted. Yet the truth persisted in whispers, that the Huns were not just fighting a war, but feeding something older, something insatiable. Even centuries later in the lands they once ravaged, peasants spoke of strange nights when red fire burned on the horizon and the wind carried the sound of horses and drums. They said it was the Huns, feasting again. Now tell me in the comments, what do you think drove these men to such extremes? Faith? Madness? Or something even darker that humanity still carries within? In the summer of 452, the city of Aquileia stood as the jewel of northern Italy, proud, wealthy, and unafraid. Behind its mighty walls, merchants whispered that even if the world trembled, Aquileia would endure. But they were wrong. On the horizon, the steppe thunder was coming. The Huns appeared like a mirage rising from the plain. Hundreds of thousands of hooves shook the ground as Attila's horde surrounded the city. The defenders manned the ramparts, watching in disbelief as black banners rippled beneath the crimson sky. Then came the sound that froze every soul within the walls. The eerie blare of Hunnic war horns, deep and guttural, echoing across the fields like the voice of doom itself. Attila's siege began not with battle but with patience. His men cut the roads, poisoned the wells, and slaughtered any who tried to escape. Hunger and fear gnawed at the citizens. The once bustling markets became morgues. Mothers whispered prayers to gods who no longer listened. Then the assault began. Wave after wave of Hunnic warriors hurled themselves at the walls. Their siege machines, crude but relentless, tore through stone and mortar. The defenders fought bravely, but the Huns were tireless, fighting day and night, their fury unbroken by exhaustion. When Aquileia finally fell, it did so not with a scream, but with silence. The gates were smashed, the towers burned, and the people slaughtered where they stood. Those who tried to flee were hunted in the fields. The city that had stood for 6 centuries vanished in a single week. Even its name was almost erased, a ghost swallowed by the fire. Later, Roman chroniclers wrote that not even the foundations of Aquileia remained. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed the city to hide the shame of its destruction. The few who escaped told tales of Attila riding through the ruins, silent and expressionless, as if inspecting the work of some divine punishment. That night no stars shone above the Adriatic. The sky, thick with smoke and ash, seemed to mourn, and in the darkness, Europe finally understood. The Huns were not a passing storm. They were an extinction. By the time the fires of Aquileia faded, Rome knew the truth. It could not defeat Attila. The empire that once commanded the world now sent emissaries crawling to the tent of the barbarian king, bearing gold, jewels, and promises of eternal loyalty. Peace with the Huns had a price, and it was steep. The emperors of both East and West agreed to pay tribute, not once but yearly, a river of gold flowing from the heart of civilization to the throne of the steppes. What had once been taxes for soldiers now fed the very enemy those soldiers feared. For the Romans it was humiliation. For Attila, it was triumph without battle. The barbarian ruler treated each tribute not as a gift, but as proof of submission. When the gold arrived, he would have it melted and reforged into ornaments for his warriors. A display of Roman weakness turned into Hunnic pride. The coins that once bore the image of emperors now adorned the arms of the very men who burned their cities. Those who refused to pay learned the consequences quickly. The city of Nisus, once flourishing, was annihilated. The bones of its citizens were left piled in the streets, bleached by the sun, a warning carved into history. But Attila's genius lay not only in destruction. He wielded fear as diplomacy, knowing that terror was cheaper than war. Ambassadors described his presence as unbearable, a man of iron will whose gaze silenced entire halls. He spoke little, but his silence carried more weight than 1,000 threats. Rome's senators debated endlessly whether paying tribute was cowardice or survival. Yet as gold caravans continued eastward, the truth became undeniable. The empire had become the servant of the very enemy it once sought to destroy, and with every coin that crossed the border, Attila's legend grew. To his people he was the chosen scourge, the hand of divine vengeance. To the Romans, he was the embodiment of their decay. Peace had been bought, yes, but the soul of Rome had been sold. When the fires of Attila's campaigns finally dimmed, they left behind a continent scarred beyond recognition. The Huns had come and gone like a nightmare made flesh, a storm that consumed everything and left only silence. But even in their absence, their shadow endured. Attila's death in 453 was as sudden and mysterious as his rise. Some said he died on his wedding night, suffocated by his own blood, a punishment from the gods for his cruelty. Others whispered of betrayal, of a blade in the dark wielded by the woman he had sought to possess. His warriors, in mourning, buried him in secret, sealing his tomb beneath 3 rivers. According to legend, those who dug his grave were slain, so that no living man could disturb the scourge of God. Yet death did not end his reign. The empire of the Huns fractured, but their legacy bled into the very veins of Europe. The tribes displaced by their conquests spread across the continent, the Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, all reshaping the dying Roman world. The Huns had not just burned villages, they had set in motion the transformation of civilization itself. Their name became myth. To medieval monks, Hun meant terror incarnate, the wrath of heaven unleashed upon sinful men. To later kings, Attila was both a warning and an inspiration, proof that one man's will could bend the world. Even centuries later, in the songs of the steppes, his legend lived on, not as a monster, but as a god of war, born of flame and storm. But perhaps the truest legacy of the Huns is not in blood or conquest, but in fear. The same fear that echoes through time, the fear of what lies beyond civilization's fragile borders. The Huns reminded humanity of its ancient truth, that beneath every empire's marble and gold, the wilderness still waits watching. The ashes of their passage still drift across history, invisible but eternal, a reminder that darkness is never truly gone. It merely sleeps,